Okay, so the next topic we want to address is historical materialism, and many people characterize Marx's thought as being historical materialist in orientation. So the question is, what does that mean? And then how and why can we see Marx's thought as being emblematic of historical materialism? So Marx did think in these terms, um, but he doesn't mean often when we hear the word being like materialistic or material, that means you're kind of like greedy or you're just considered having like luxurious things. And we're going to see that Marx's use of the word materialism is different. And materialism is kind of a branch of philosophy, stands in contrast to idealism. And maybe it's the best place to understand materialism is to start with idealism. The idea of idealism is that ideas are what drive history, and that ideas are derived and come about independently of economic conditions. And so in the A&E reading, you read about Hegel, and Hegel was very much an idealist. He thought that what was propelling history forward and what was the driving force of history were ideas. And basically, by thinking better and more clearly, we're going to pave the way for a better society. And it was going to basically be through hard work, concentration, reading a whole bunch, and studying that these ideas that are going to move history forward are going to come about, right? So basically, the main drivers of history are what's going on inside of people's minds. In contrast, historical materialism, the HM here, argues that material conditions of life matter both practically and theoretically. So, on a practical level, we are material beings. We live in a material world. And so we need to take our material conditions seriously. So, as biological entities, we need to eat a certain amount of food in order to sustain life. And that's not something that we can take for granted or something that we should not consider in terms of our thinking. All right. We all need a certain amount of sleep. We can't just think away the fact that we need to sleep a certain amount. So practically, we need to consider people's material needs. But then on a bigger level, and for our purposes, maybe a more important level, Marx also wants to say is that theoretically, material conditions are important too because they lead the class. They kind of help condition our class position. And then these conditions, our class position, are going to lead to certain social conditions. Are we well off? Are we poor? Do we have economic security? Do we not? They're also going to lead to our orientations, understanding, and interests. So basically, our way of thinking is going to be shaped by our material conditions. They're not just going to arise independently of uh, our economic situation. And also, material conditions are going to be the drivers of history. And we'll talk about this when we start talking about Marx's theory of history and how it contrasts with Hegel's. So to get a better sense of what historical materialist thinking looks like, we can go over the example that was brought up in A&E. So it's historically true that capitalist societies advocated for freedoms and kinds of freedoms that didn't exist before in the feudal order. And the question is, why are we seeing this? Why, when capitalism is born, do we also get these calls for freedom? If I'm an idealist, I'm going to argue something like, well, capitalist societies championed freedom because they figured out that it was good and just. And so, drawing from ideas from the Enlightenment, kind of collectively realized, oh my gosh, it's a bad thing not to give people freedom. It's a bad thing to bound them to the land. It's a bad thing to not let them pursue their own life. And so, kind of like this giant light bulb went on, and we realized freedom's a good thing. So now we should advocate for it. Okay. There wasn't anything about this economic order that caused this kind of advocacy for freedom to come about. It's just people kind of figured out this kind of freedom is good, and therefore we should advocate it in these kinds of in this kind of society. In contrast, historical materialism is going to argue that capitalism favors freedom because the owners need to be free to hire workers and fire workers as needed. So capitalists aren't necessarily champions of freedom because that's the good and right and just thing to do. They are champions of this because it makes sense for them and their bottom line. And why might this be an issue? Well, if you think back to feudal times, if you had a if you're the lord of, like, say, a feudal manor, you were obligated to your serfs basically forever, from the time they're born to the time they die. You can't really get rid of them. You're obligated to them. Just as they can't really get rid of you, they're obligated to you. So you can't fire them. You also generally just can't hire them and say, like, oh, I need more serfs over here. This is the new wage I'm going to pay, because, again, they're not really earning a wage. So, I mean, there were ways to get a hold of new lands and to gain control of serfs, but it was a pretty complicated process. And so the main way that you could increase your lands would be either through war, conquest, or just having your population grow over time, which could take generations upon generations. And so the fact that populations really couldn't move, they couldn't be hired and fired, worked in a social order that was trying to maintain stability, right? Because we talked about how feudalism was a traditionalistic order. In contrast, capitalism is a very dynamic economic system, so it wants to be able to expand and contract as needed. And so, because of these new economic needs, historical materials would say that's why capitalists started championing freedom, because it aligned with their economic interests. So freedom wasn't favored for humanitarian concerns, but it served their interests. And in general, if you're thinking in these kind of historical and materialistic terms, or even just Marxism in general, you're going to be skeptical of ideas that are put forward, or you're always going to be kind of cynical of them, and you're going to think these ideas must be being put forward for a particular reason, and that reason is that it serves the interests of those who are championing them. So if I'm a Marxist, I'm not surprised that when health concerns started being raised about smoking, that all of the studies that were funded by cigarette companies found that smoking was perfectly fine and maybe even healthy for you. All right. Again, I'm going to take a very cynical route and say they figured out that smoking wasn't good for you, but that knowledge would hurt their bottom line. So they funded research that benefited them. Right? The research wasn't done to uncover the real situation. It was done to come up with, I guess, in parlance of today, fake news in order so as not to hurt their financial stakes and their financial well-being. Similarly, if you look at the studies that show that fossil fuels are not creating climate change, a big portion of them are funded by fossil fuel companies. And again, if I'm a Marxist, this makes perfect sense to me that if fossil fuels are hurting the environment, and that's a bad thing, and if that's the case, then maybe we need to come up with alternative energy sources, then that kind of knowledge would hurt my financial interests. So I'm going to come up with my own knowledge in order to ways that will benefit me. Okay. So again, if you're thinking along the lines of Marxist orientation, you're always thinking these kind of cynical terms. All right. So while Marx is in general going to say that, again, our material conditions are going to shape our understandings and our thoughts and our interests. Not all interests are treated equally. All right. So class does lead to interests, but not all interests are treated equally. And in particular, the main idea that comes from the German ideology section that you read is that the ruling ideas of society are those of the ruling class. So who's ever able to economically dominate a society, from Marx's point of view, they're also able to control the ideas that are put out there, or at least heavily influence the ideas that are put out there. And the way this works from Marx's point of view is that class-based interests are falsely framed as being part of a universally ideal way of doing things, which another way of saying is what is best for some, or a small group, is framed as being the best for all. So an example of this that you could view through a Marxist frame would be Ronald Reagan's idea that tax cuts for the wealthy are good because the benefits of that trickle down to everyone else. So if I'm Reagan, I want to argue, well, we're taxing the rich a lot. If we tax them less, they're going to have all this money lying around. And if they have that money lying around, then they're going to use it in some productive ways. So they're going to invest in new businesses and new factories and those kind of things. And once they do that, there's going to be more people are going to be hired, more people are going to be working. And so that's going to be beneficial for everyone. So everyone is served by having these tax cuts made for the wealthy. In contrast, if I'm a Marxist, I basically say this is BS, because I'm going to say, yes, the wealthy want to pay less taxes, but they don't want to pay less taxes because it's going to be beneficial to everyone. They just want to pay less taxes because it's beneficial for them. So if they get a tax break, what are they going to do? They're going to hoard that money. They're going to use it for themselves. They're going to buy yachts. They're going to buy vacation homes. They'll just put it in their bank account. And then therefore, they're getting more money. But now there's less money that's being collected through taxes. So social programs that could be beneficial to those who are, say, poor on the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum, now there's less resources for them. So what is framed as this is going to be good for everyone across the board is actually driven by class interests. And again, kind of the wealthy looking out for their own interests. Okay. So whether or not trickle-down economics is the best for all, or it's only the best for some, is something we won't settle in this class. But just understanding that mindset and mentality of looking at a particular idea that's being put forward, tracing it back to a particular class position and the interests of that class. That's what is important to understand when we're trying to be able to think in historical, materialistic terms. And it's going to be important, particularly important, and understand what historical materialism means, and again, how it conceives of where thoughts and interests come from, is particularly important when we talk about Marx's theory of history, which will be the next topic we're going to address.